Picture this. The year is 890 after Christ, and the North Atlantic Ocean is a merciless killer. We're talking about an era when the very idea of reliable navigation was still centuries away, no compasses, no charts worth trusting, and absolutely no concept of what we'd call modern weather forecasting. Ships simply vanished into the grey void of winter storms, taking entire families, entire communities, entire futures with them. Now imagine you're standing on the storm-lashed docks of Trondheim, watching the horizon swallow your loved ones whole. That's the world Erik Thorson was born, into a world where the sea gave life with one hand and dealt death with the other, and where accepting fate was considered the height of wisdom. But Erik was different. First off, he was enormous. We're talking about a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall, in an age when most people barely reached 5.5 feet. Think about that for a moment in a world built for smaller people, where longships were cramped quarters even for average-sized Vikings. Erik literally couldn't stand up straight below deck. The other warriors called him Erik the Tall, and not always kindly. In the mead halls, his height brought mockery. Young men would joke about how he had to duck through doorways, how he looked like a giant trying to fit into a child's world. But here's the thing about being tall in the age of sail, and this is where Erik's story gets interesting. When you're standing on the deck of a longship in rough seas, when waves are towering like moving mountains around you, being able to see farther than anyone else isn't just an advantage. It's the difference between life and death. Erik's awakening came during his first real voyage at 16 years old. Picture a gangly teenager, all arms and legs, cramped into a longship where he literally could not stand upright, sailing into what would become known as the nightmare blizzard of 890. The expedition started with 20 ships, 20 vessels, carrying the hopes and dreams of entire communities. These weren't just trading missions, they were lifelines. Each ship represented families who would eat that winter or go hungry, trade routes that would prosper or collapse, expansion dreams that would flourish or die. The storm hit them off the Orkney Islands like the hammer of Thor himself. Within hours, those 20 ships scattered like seeds in a hurricane. Erik watched, and this detail comes down to us through the sagas as his uncle's ship, the Times Seawolf *, simply vanished into the white void. One moment it was there, close enough that you could make out individual figures on deck, and the next moment it was gone, completely gone. The horror wasn't just the disappearance, it was the sounds. Desperate horn calls cutting through the howling wind, each one a crew's final plea for help, for guidance, for anything. But in a storm like that, with visibility measured in feet, rather than miles, those calls might as well have been whispers. Ships passed within touching distance of each other, completely invisible to one another. That night, 300 men drowned while their kinsmen sailed blindly past, so close they could have reached out and touched salvation if they'd only known it was there. When the survivors limped back to Trondheim weeks later, only 12 ships returned out of 20. Erik did something that went against everything he'd been taught about accepting the will of the gods. He counted the cost, and the numbers were staggering. 40% of ships that sailed in winter storms never came home. 40%. That's not just statistics, that's entire bloodlines ending, trade networks collapsing, communities slowly starving. His own father, Jarl Thorson, had lost 2 brothers to storms, the old navigators, the grizzled veterans who'd survived decades at sea, preached submission to divine will. They'd gather around the fire pits and speak in reverent tones about how the sea gods demanded their sacrifices, how it was the natural order of things. But Erik looked at the empty chairs around those same fires, chairs that should have held uncles, cousins, friends, and saw only waste. Through that dark winter, while the rest of Trondheim mourned and accepted, Erik brooded. Ships were more than transportation in Norse society. They were the arteries carrying the lifeblood of their entire civilization. Every lost vessel meant families sliding into poverty, trade routes being abandoned, plans for expansion grinding to a halt. The sea demanded tribute. Yes, but did it have to demand so much? The breakthrough, and this is one of those moments that historians love, because it shows how world-changing innovations can spring from the most ordinary circumstances, came during a winter feast. Erik was sitting by the fire, watching his young daughter Thora play with his red cloak. She was maybe 4 years old, waving that bright fabric around like a banner, making it dance in the firelight. And Eric noticed something. Even through the smoke-filled hall, even with dozens of people moving around, even with the flickering, uncertain light of the fire, that red fabric caught your eye. It was visible. More than visible, it was impossible to ignore. The high-contrast colours his wife Astrid wove into their clan tapestries stood out against any background. That night, long after the feast ended and the hall fell silent, Eric worked by candlelight. He sketched designs for mast-mounted signals using the same high-contrast patterns, red against white, gold against black combinations that would cut through fog, through snow, through the visual chaos of a storm at sea. The idea seemed almost embarrassingly simple, so simple, in fact, that it felt foolish. But Norwegian winters had taught Eric something about solutions. The brutal cold, the long darkness, the constant struggle for survival, it all stripped away complexity and revealed basic truths. The best ideas, the ones that actually worked when your life depended on them, were usually the simplest ones. Not simple as in easy, but simple as in fundamental, elegant, unbreakable. As spring approached and the ice began to break up in Trondheim's harbour, Eric found himself staring out at the grey water with a question that would change maritime history forever. What if ships didn't have to disappear into the void? What if there was a way to keep them visible to each other, even when the gods themselves seemed determined to hide them? He had no idea that his daughter's innocent game with a red cloak would lead to a revolution that would echo across centuries, that would guide Columbus across the Atlantic and help Magellan navigate the Pacific. All he knew was that too many good men were dying in storms, and maybe, just maybe, there was something he could do about it. The question now was whether anyone would be brave enough to try, something that had never been tested, in an ocean that had never forgiven a mistake. Spring of 891 brought Eric's moment of truth. Picture the scene. Trondheim's harbour coming alive after the long winter, ice breaking up with sounds like thunder, and ships being hauled from their winter shelters. This was the season when Vikings launched their most ambitious ventures, trading expeditions that could make or break entire communities for the coming year. Eric needed allies, and convincing seasoned sea captains to try an untested innovation was like asking them to bet their lives on a child's game. Remember, these were men who'd survived decades in some of the most dangerous waters on Earth by following traditions passed down through generations. The old ways had kept them alive. Why risk everything on the wild idea of a young giant who couldn't even fit properly in a longship? But Eric had something powerful working in his favour. Economics. The previous winters, losses had been catastrophic, even by Viking standards. Entire families faced starvation. Trade networks that had taken generations to build lay in ruins. When survival is at stake, even the most conservative minds start considering radical alternatives. Eric approached 5 captains with his proposal. Not 20, not 10, just 5. He knew that if he could prove the concept with a small group, word would spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community of Norse seafarers. The expedition he proposed was perfect for testing. A trading run to Iceland, dangerous enough to matter, but not so risky as to be suicidal. The signal system he'd developed was elegantly simple. Strips of red and yellow fabric mounted high on the masts, with specific patterns meaning all clear, danger, or follow me. The beauty was in the contrast. These colours could cut through fog, stand out against grey skies, and remain visible even in driving snow. Each pattern was distinct enough that even sailors squinting through spray and wind could recognise the message. But simplicity doesn't mean easy acceptance. The veteran navigator Olaf Crowbane, and that nickname tells you something about his temperament, mocked Eric openly at the harbour. Picture this grizzled sea wolf, scarred by decades of storms, pointing at Eric's bright banners and calling them the fool's flower dancing on the mast. To Crowbane, and others like him, Eric's innovation wasn't just untested, it was an insult to the memory of every sailor who died following the old ways. The test came sooner and more dramatically than anyone expected. 3 days out from Trondheim, while they were still getting used to the rhythm of the signals, Nature delivered exactly the kind of challenge Eric had designed his system to meet. A fog bank rolled in like a grey wall, swallowing the small fleet so completely that sailors literally couldn't see their own bow from the stern. This is where the story gets remarkable. Instead of scattering, which was the natural, instinctive response when visibility dropped to zero, the ships maintained formation. Picture 5 longships moving through fog so thick it was like sailing inside a cloud, staying together by following those bright signals that cut through the murk like beacons of hope. When they arrived in Reykjavik's harbour, still in formation, still together, the Icelandic traders couldn't believe what they were seeing. Word spread through the trading posts faster than Eric could have imagined. Within months, ambitious jarls from Norway to Denmark were demanding that Eric teach their crews. The economic advantages were simply undeniable. Merchants who adopted the signal system reported 70% fewer losses in poor visibility. 70%. Think about what that means in human terms. Instead of watching 4 out of 10 ships vanish into storms, suddenly communities were losing only 1 in 10. The difference between prosperity and starvation, between expansion and retreat, between hope and despair. But success in the Viking world bred something predictable: resistance from those whose power depended on the old ways. The Navigators Guild had maintained a monopoly on sea knowledge for generations. These were the men who memorized the positions of stars, who could read weather patterns in the flight of birds, who passed down secret knowledge from father to son. Eric's innovation threatened all of that. They fought back in the way that threatened establishments always do, by attacking the innovation as dangerous to the natural order. Guild members spread rumors that Eric's signals angered Ran, the goddess of the drowned, who would demand greater sacrifices to balance this disruption of fate. They whispered that the bright banners were acts of hubris that would bring down divine wrath on anyone foolish enough to use them. The conflict exploded at the Nidaros Thing Assembly, the great gathering, where free men settled disputes and made decisions that affected entire regions. Eric found himself facing a formal challenge from the very heart of the maritime establishment. Olaf Crobane, backed by the full weight of the Navigators Guild, demanded what Vikings called a trial by storm. The concept was brutally simple. Both men would lead fleets through dangerous weather, and the gods themselves would judge whose approach found favor. It was trial by combat writ large across the North Atlantic, with dozens of lives hanging in the balance. The Great Storm of 894 became the stuff of legend even while it was happening. Hurricane winds off the Scottish coast created conditions that would challenge modern vessels, much less 9th-century longships. Waves towered higher than church spires. Winds howled with voices that seemed to come from the underworld itself, and visibility dropped to arm's length. Olaf Crobane led his fleet, using every traditional method known to Viking: seamanship, reading wave patterns, following bird flight, trusting to instinct and experience built up over decades. His 12 ships scattered according to the old ways, each captain making individual decisions based on traditional knowledge. Eric's signal-equipped fleet faced the same murderous conditions, but with one crucial difference: they could see each other. Those red and gold banners, mounted high on the masts, remained visible even when everything else disappeared into the chaos. When one ship spotted danger, its signal warned the others. When the lead vessel found safe passage, the entire fleet could follow. The results spoke louder than any argument. Olaf's traditional fleet lost 7 ships out of 12. More than half his force simply vanished into the storm, taking their crews to the bottom. Eric's fleet lost only 1 vessel, and that only when its mast snapped under the hurricane winds, taking the signals with it. But here's the detail that turned skeptics into believers. Eric's ships didn't just survive. They rescued 90 men from Olaf's foundering vessels, guided by distress signals that cut through the storm's fury. Most dramatically, Olaf Crobane himself survived only because Eric's longship found him clinging to wreckage. Guided by the red banner his desperate crew waved in their final moments. Picture that scene. The old sea wolf, who'd mocked Eric's innovation, now owed his life to those very signals he'd called foolish flowers. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but what mattered more was the proof. The signals worked. They saved lives. They turned the North Atlantic from an unpredictable killer into something that could be managed, navigated, survived. But the real revolution was just beginning, because the women of the Norse communities saw possibilities in Eric's innovation that even he hadn't imagined. By 920 after Christ, something extraordinary had happened. Eric's simple innovation had grown into what historians would later call the Storm Shepherd Network, a maritime communication system that stretched from the ice fields of Greenland to the golden domes of Constantinople. But this wasn't just about technological spread. This was about cultural transformation on a scale that would reshape the known world. Here's what's fascinating about how innovations actually spread in the medieval world. They don't just get copied, they get adapted, improved, and evolved by each community that adopts them. Eric's basic red and gold banners became the foundation for something far more sophisticated than even he had imagined. Each region developed its own signal dialect, perfectly adapted to local conditions. The Norwegians, dealing with the brutal Arctic conditions, favored stark geometric patterns that could cut through blinding snow. Think sharp crosses, bold stripes, angular designs that remained visible even when ice crystals coated everything in sight. The Danes, sailing through the frequent rain squalls of the North Sea, developed sequential color changes, patterns that shifted from one hue to another to convey complex messages, even when visibility came and went with the weather. But the Swedish Vikings created perhaps the most ingenious adaptation. During their long winter darkness, and we're talking about months where the sun barely rises, they incorporated reflective materials into their signals. Polished metal discs, carefully treated surfaces that caught and amplified even the faintest light. A Swedish signal mast could catch the glow of Aurora Borealis and turn it into communication. Now, let's talk about scale. The signals revolutionized Viking expansion in ways that rippled across continents. Leif Eriksson's legendary expedition to Vinland, what we now call North America, succeeded partly because his fleet maintained cohesion while crossing the treacherous Labrador Current. Think about that for a moment. The first European expedition to reach the Fovik, New World, depended on an innovation developed by a Norwegian giant who just wanted to save ships from vanishing in storms. The military applications were game-changing. The Battle of Hjörungavåg in 986 saw outnumbered Norwegian forces defeat a much larger Danish fleet through coordinated maneuvers that would have been impossible without visual communication. Picture this: 60 Norwegian ships facing nearly 100 Danish vessels, but the Norwegians could coordinate their movements like a single organism, while the Danes fought as individual units. The result wasn't even close. Signal stations sprouted along every major trade route like medieval lighthouses. These weren't just simple beacon fires, they were sophisticated communication hubs, manned by trained operators who swore oaths of loyalty and secrecy. The operators developed an almost mystical reputation. They were required to maintain their posts through the worst weather, to never abandon their signals, even when their own lives were at risk. And Erik? Erik became known as the Beacon King. Though he never held formal royal title, he established what became the Signal Academy in Trondheim, the first institution dedicated to maritime communication. Students came from across the known world, Irish monks seeking to improve their lighthouse systems, Frankish merchants wanting to protect their river convoys, even Byzantine naval officers studying northern innovations. The curriculum was remarkable for its time. Students didn't just learn signal patterns, they studied weather reading, equipment maintenance in extreme conditions, and what the Academy called the sacred responsibility of the mast. This last concept was crucial. Signal operators weren't just technicians, they were guardians of life itself. Their vigilance meant the difference between ships reaching port safely and families waiting forever for loved ones who would never return. But here's where the story takes on deeper, more human dimensions. The innovation that began as Erik's simple solution to a navigation problem had become something that touched every aspect of Norse society. Women, initially excluded from the seafaring world, found themselves at the center of the signal revolution. Erik's wife, Astrid, developed what became known as the Astrid Codes, a sophisticated system using her weaving patterns to create complex visual messages. Different combinations of stripes, crosses, and circles could convey detailed information about weather conditions, safe harbors, even political situations in distant ports. The beauty of the system was that it looked like decorative art to outsiders, but trained signal operators could read it like text. Coastal communities established beacon rights, sacred obligations to maintain shore signals that guided ships to safety. These weren't just community responsibilities, they were deeply personal commitments. The wife of a lost sailor would tend her family's beacon, keeping faith that the signals would guide him home. Mothers taught daughters the signal patterns alongside traditional women's skills. What started as a male-dominated innovation became a community effort that involved everyone. The human cost of innovation emerged in quieter, more personal stories. Eric's own son Harold died testing new signal materials during a volcanic storm off Iceland. The boy was only 19, experimenting with different fabric treatments that might remain visible through volcanic ash. His death nearly broke Eric, but it also solidified his determination to make the signals as reliable as humanly possible. His daughter Sigrid became the first female signal master, developing night communication using oil-soaked banners that burned with colored flames. She created what became known as Sigrid's stars, burning signals that could cut through complete darkness. The technique was dangerous. More than one signal operator died when the flames got out of control, but it extended communication into the night hours when storms often struck without warning. The knowledge became so valuable that signal masters traveled with bodyguards. Their code books were worth more than gold because they represented the difference between profitable trade and catastrophic loss. Rival jarls tried to steal signal secrets through spies and bribes. There are documented cases of signal masters being kidnapped and held for ransom, not for their personal wealth, but for the knowledge they carried. Eric's final voyage, when he was 70 years old, entered the realm of mythology, even as it happened. A massive trading fleet over 200 ships was caught in what survivors called the worst blizzard in living memory off the Faroe Islands. The fleet sent desperate signals that cut through the storm like cries for help. Eric personally led the rescue fleet, his giant frame still unmistakable at the helm despite his age. Witnesses swore his red cloak glowed like divine fire as he guided ship after ship to safety through the storm paths he'd spent a lifetime learning to read. Then, with most of the fleet safe, his own ship turned back into the teeth of the blizzard, seeking the last few survivors. That was the last anyone saw of Eric the Tall. His ship vanished into the white fury of the storm, but the legend says he's still out there, sailing the storm paths, his eternal signal guiding lost sailors home. Some say it's just sailor superstition, but even today, fishermen in the North Atlantic report seeing a giant figure in a red cloak during the worst storms, pointing the way to safety. The man who started with a simple idea about keeping ships visible to each other had created something that would outlast his own lifetime by centuries. But the real test of Eric's innovation was yet to come when the medieval world gave way to the age of exploration, and his Storm Shepherd network would guide ships to corners of the earth he never could have imagined. Here's what's remarkable about truly transformative innovations. They don't just solve the immediate problem they were designed for. They create ripple effects that continue for centuries, shaping events and enabling achievements that their creators never could have imagined. Eric the Tall's simple solution to keeping Viking ships visible in storms became the foundation for humanity's conquest of the world's oceans. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, one of the most pivotal events in European history, succeeded partly because William's invasion fleet maintained formation while crossing the English Channel using signal techniques that descended directly from Eric's innovations. Picture nearly 700 ships crossing one of the world's most treacherous waterways in coordinated formation, guided by red and gold banners that would have been instantly recognizable to any Storm Shepherd from 3 centuries earlier. During the Crusades, Northern European fleets confounded Mediterranean sailors with their ability to coordinate in storms that scattered traditional vessels. Byzantine admirals, accustomed to fair-weather sailing in relatively calm seas, watched in amazement as Norman and Danish crusader fleets maintained complex formations through weather that should have been impossible to navigate. But the real explosion came during what we call the Age of Exploration. Christopher Columbus, sailing into the unknown Atlantic in 1492, carried signal procedures that were direct descendants of Eric's patterns. His flagship Santa Maria bore red and gold banners mounted high on the mainmast, banners that any 10th-century storm shepherd would have recognized instantly. When Columbus's 3 ships became separated in Atlantic storms, they found each other again using visual signals refined over 6 centuries of Norse seamanship. Portuguese navigators exploring the African coast adapted Viking fog signals for tropical rainforests. Picture this: techniques developed in the ice-cold North Atlantic being used to navigate steaming rivers in equatorial Africa, proving that good ideas transcend geography and climate. Vasco da Gama's fleet, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, stayed together through Indian Ocean monsoons, using principles that Eric had discovered while watching his daughter play with a red cloak. Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe, the first voyage to prove that the world was truly round, depended on signal coordination to keep his fleet together through Pacific storms that dwarfed anything the North Atlantic could produce. When Magellan died in the Philippines, his remaining ships continued using the same visual communication system to coordinate their movements across oceans that no European had ever seen before. The human stories that carry these innovations forward are often the most compelling part of the larger narrative. Fishing families in the Lofoten Islands, the same region where Eric first tested his signals, maintained his original patterns for 800 years, passing the knowledge from parent to child like a sacred trust. During World War II, Norwegian resistance fighters used ancient Viking signals to coordinate with British submarines operating in the same waters where Eric had once rescued Olaf Crowbane from a storm. Think about that continuity for a moment. A communication system developed in the 9th century, after Christ was still being used effectively in the 20th century, more than 1,000 years later. German code breakers, with all their sophisticated machinery and mathematical expertise, couldn't crack a system that was based on nothing more complex than colored fabric patterns and human ingenuity. Modern maritime law requires visual signals as backup to radio communication, a direct descendant of Eric's innovation. Every ship that crosses the world's oceans today carries signal flags that follow international standards. But those standards evolved from the same basic principles Eric discovered: high contrast colors, simple patterns, and the understanding that technology can fail when you need it most, but fabric in wind remains reliable. Arctic research vessels studying climate change in the same waters where Eric once sailed use modernized Viking signal patterns for navigation when GPS satellites fail and radio communication goes dead in magnetic storms. The International Space Station has studied traditional Norse visual communication techniques for potential use in Mars missions, where radio delays mean that instant communication becomes impossible and visual signals might save lives. The principle Eric discovered that human ingenuity can pierce nature's chaos guides every beacon, lighthouse, and emergency flare in use today. When Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, when the Asian tsunami overwhelmed coastal cities, when natural disasters knocked out modern communication systems, survivors often fell back on the most basic visual signals: bright colors, simple patterns, anything that could be seen from a distance. NASA has studied Viking visual communication for Mars mission contingencies, understanding that when you're millions of miles from Earth and technology fails, the basic principles of high-contrast visual signals might mean the difference between life and death. Ocean racing yachts in the most prestigious competitions carry signal banners based directly on Eric's original high-contrast patterns, because even in an age of satellite tracking and instant global communication, sometimes the simplest solutions remain the most reliable. Climate researchers in Antarctica, working in conditions that would have been familiar to any Viking, use modernized versions of Eric's signals when radio communication fails in magnetic storms. The principle remains exactly the same. When you can't communicate by voice, you communicate by sight, using patterns that cut through chaos and confusion. In museums from Oslo to New York, fragments of ancient signal banners rest under climate-controlled glass, red and gold fabric, faded by centuries but still bearing the geometric patterns that saved countless lives. Maritime festivals across Scandinavia commemorate Eric's innovation with spectacular displays of traditional signals, keeping alive a tradition that spans more than a millennium. But perhaps the most enduring legacy lives in the stories that sailors still tell. Old fishermen in ports from Iceland to Ireland swear that in the worst storms, when modern technology fails and death seems certain, you might glimpse a giant figure in a red cloak standing at the bow of an impossible ship, pointing the way home. They say Eric the Tall still sails the storm paths, his eternal beacon guiding travellers through the darkness. The skeptics dismiss these as superstition, the romantic fantasies of people who make their living from the sea. But every professional sailor knows that the ocean holds mysteries that technology can't explain, and that sometimes the oldest solutions prove to be the most enduring. Eric the Tall's foolish trick, that simple idea of keeping ships visible to each other through bright colours and clever patterns, became humanity's conversation with the darkness itself. It was a language of survival written in wind and colour, a testament to the idea that individual innovation can ripple across centuries and change the world. Today, every time a ship's horn sounds in fog, every time a lighthouse beam cuts through storm clouds, every time an emergency flare arcs across dark water, we're hearing echoes of a conversation that began more than 1,000 years ago in a smoke-filled Viking hall, when a young giant watched his daughter play with a red cloak and saw a way to bring lost sailors home. The storm-darkened seas that once swallowed ships whole now carry vessels guided by principles that Eric would recognize instantly. His innovation didn't just save ships, it opened the world's oceans to human exploration, trade, and discovery. Not bad for a man who was too tall to stand up straight in his own longship. The giants who once walked the storm-darkened seas left footprints that we follow still, and their lights continue to guide us home through the endless night.